Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have laboured to it without the reward of priority. Now for the run home and a desperate struggle. I wonder if we can do it.
Setting out from here at Cape Evans in the austral summer of 1911, Captain Robert Scott and his companions walked nearly 900 miles to the South Pole, only to find that the priority, the fame of being first, had gone to the Norwegian Amundsen. In that desperate struggle home, Scott and his 4 companions died. It was to be 8 months before the bodies were found and buried where they lay in a river of ice that is carrying them inch by inch back towards the sea. The hut has been frozen in time, exactly as it was when it was abandoned almost 80 years ago. A shrine to the courage and perhaps the folly of man in Antarctica. "80 years later, helicopters have replaced the huskies of the first explorers. The edges of the continent have been made a little safer for humans. Now Antarctica itself is in danger. The mountains may be disfigured by mining. The pristine ice has been touched by pollution. Radiation through the hole in the ozone layer threatens the plankton upon which all life in the Southern Ocean depends. Some fear that the ice that cools the whole planet will melt in the heat of the greenhouse effect. If humanity destroys Antarctica, will we also destroy life on Earth? In a ship little bigger than those which carried the first explorers, Greenpeace sails from Auckland, New Zealand, bound for their base next to Scott's Hut on Cape Evans. The Gondwana is laden with enough food and fuel to keep the base running for a year. It's a long goodbye. 5 volunteers will be left on the ice for 12 months. 4 who have lived at the base through the long southern winter will be returned to civilization. The Greenpeace base is right next to Scott's Hut on Cape Evans, at the foot of the live volcano Mount Erebus. The New Zealand base is across the bay at Pram Point, and next to it, enveloping Scott's first hut, is the American McMurdo base, the first town of Antarctica. There are 52 all-year-round bases, officially devoted to scientific research, and confined in the main to the tiny 2% of land that is ice-free for at least part of the year. Territorial claims have been frozen by the Antarctic Treaty. The notional cake is split between Norway, Australia, France and New Zealand, and Britain, whose claimed slice is contested by Chile and Argentina. The United States and Soviet Union have yet to stake claims on the continent. So while the treaty holds, this is no man's land. No laws outside international agreements, no crimes. No frontiers, no police. This land is free for those who can survive in it. Survive in the coldest, windiest desert on Earth. A tiny amount of snow falls in Antarctica, it just blows around. Over aeons, it is compressed into ice. The cliffs of the Ross Ice Shelf, hundreds of feet high, the border of an ice land the size of France, anchored to the earth, yet covering the water. The ice is never still. It creeps constantly towards the sea, then breaks into icebergs. Now the ice shelf holds the biggest airport in Antarctica. Scott's Great Ice Barrier has become the Great White Way to the pole. The new explorers fly Navy. This is Williams Field, an 8.5-hour flight from the Navy's base in Christchurch, New Zealand. The pole is another 3 hours away. Those who fly this route say it's like jumping time and space. For the Gondwana's crew, it'll be a 3-week voyage. The 2,500-mile trip from New Zealand to the base in Antarctica normally takes a fortnight, but this time the Gondwana is making a 600-mile detour northwest to the Tasman Sea to track down a Japanese whaling fleet.
The thing you've got to be absolutely sure about is that that repeater up there is reading exactly the same as that steering wheel.
In the lee of Ball's Pyramid, a witch's hat of rock off the northeast coast of Australia, they lay an ambush for the whalers, sailing south to kill 300 minke whales as part of what Japan calls a program of scientific whaling. The plan is to stop the mothership, the Nishin Maru, by dropping swimmers in front of the bow.
Yes. By the time the divers have moved down there, this boat will track back down to the stern, rendezvous with the two smaller boats, transfer the divers back into the big boat, and then all get in position again and start over.
3 of the volunteers who will form this human barrier are due to spend the next year on the ice of Antarctica.
Nishan Nauru, I take it for granted that you are listening to our broadcast. My name is Keith Swenson. I will be one of the activists who will be jumping into the water in front of your boat to stop your boat from whaling, to stop your boat from continuing on down to the Antarctic.
This is Sabine Schmidt. I'm from Germany. I'm working as a scientist for Greenpeace, and I will be one of the people who will be in front of your ship. We appeal to you to stop whaling and to return to Japan.
Nishan Maru, my name is Wojtek Moskal, I'm from Poland. I will be in the water as well. I really believe that there is no need for hunting whales any longer, so this is why I'm going. I will try, I hope I will stop you and you will go back to Japan.
Going?
You want on the other side, are you, mate?
Oh yes.
Yeah, I'll come around the back of Ken.
Go to the right, rotate to the right. That's it. Shit, his slope's touched.
Yeah.
Go.
The 20,000-ton ship plows on.
Okay, hang in here. Hang in here.
The bow wave pushes them aside. The real danger is being sucked under the sloping sides of the boat and into the propellers.
afraid, look a bit uncomfortable.
That's the least of his worries.
The Mission Maru declines to answer the Gondwana, even when the caller speaks Japanese.
第3西丸、第3西丸、こちらゴンドワナ、こちらゴンドワナ号、聞こえますか？聞こえたら応答願います。第3西丸、応答願います。No answer. No.
Yeah, I will give you.
Wojtek, how do you feel? How do you feel now you've done it?
Oh, great! It was really great. It was much easier jump from the chopper than from the boat. Yeah.
You must have been terrified watching that thing bear down on you.
You mean you've been terrifying or the other guys?
You must have been terrified.
No.
Do you think the captain was more frightened than you?
Yeah, for the first time I think he was a little bit frightened because he stopped the engine and Keith was quite close. But then I think that they used to it and I don't know. But it was pretty good, yeah.
The mothership steams on. It's heading for a rendezvous with its 3 hunting ships more than 1,000 miles south in the ice of the Southern Ocean. The Gondwana follows. Greenpeace activists will make a second attempt to stop the whalers before heading for their base in Antarctica. This is the first time the 5 who will spend winter on the ice have sat down to talk together. 3 men and 2 women will spend the next 12 months isolated in a wooden hut. How will they cope with the tensions?
Last time I went down with the team 2 years ago, and I was the only woman on the team, and I was asked this question, and I don't know what to say, because I don't see a problem, and I don't even think about it.
We are there ideologically. Our ideal is the Greenpeace, protecting Antarctica from the white man's greed, and in this case we are going to be together for the idealistic purposes. I don't think sex can come in it at all.
For me, I'm just completely intrigued with the idea of saving one continent. And we've got 7 continents on the Earth. We've completely screwed up 6 of them. And I believe if we can save just one continent, we can possibly reverse the trends we see in the rest of the world.
It's in the interests of scientists to preserve the Antarctic. The contamination that clouds the rest of the planet has so far hardly touched the continent. So Antarctica is a benchmark by which to measure the extent of pollution in other countries. At Cape Bird, Gordon Court is using polar skewers as barometers of pollution. He tags the skewers and monitors pollutants in their blood each year when they return to breed. This bird is 32 years old.
They do move a tremendous distance from the Antarctic in winter, and these Ross Sea populations are known to travel up as far north as Alaska and moving through the Sea of Japan, off British Columbia, down again through California and South American coasts. So they do move over some pretty polluted waters, and they come back with some interesting loads of pesticides and things like PCBs as well, heavy metals. The neat thing about it, though, is that you can look at residues in this bird and know that it didn't come from just down the way. It comes to a very clean place to breed, so you don't have to worry about a local source of pollution spoiling your result.
He's comparing them with the Delhi penguins at the Cape Bird Rookery, who spend their whole lives in the Antarctic. Even they carry traces of some of the most poisonous pollutants, such as PCBs.
Yeah, that was the neat part, and that they're very valuable in that way, and that they can be used to monitor global change for the next 20, 50 years. And you know that anything you see is likely to reflect the world levels rather than a local situation, and that's what's particularly useful about looking at pesticides in as far away as the Antarctic. Yeah.
In a remote spot on the Ross Ice Shelf, John Mack is sampling air. He's working on a joint New Zealand and American survey covering thousands of miles of Antarctica from the coast to the South Pole.
Essentially, this equipment is a whole air sampling system. What it does is grab about 1,200 liters of clean air, compress them into these aluminum cylinders here to about 800 pounds. Essentially what it'll do is enable us to determine how well the atmosphere cleans itself up. And then what we can do is figure out, from that, we can figure out how much man's influence will affect that ability. A lot of this has to do with comparisons between the northern and the southern hemispheres, or between this particular area down south and other more populated areas. So we use the southern hemisphere, and in particular the high latitudes in the southern hemisphere, as a sort of baseline value, and then compare that with other areas which are more populated. It's not perfect, but it's pretty close.
In this frigid, dry climate, the past is preserved. Antarctica can snuff out life in minutes, but the organic remains may linger for a century. So does the inorganic detritus of civilization. A few miles down the road, the melting ice lays bare remnants of more recent pollution in water that was until a few years ago the cleanest in the world. Above it, the road from Williams Airfield to the American base, McMurdo. This fuel pipeline runs 3.5 miles from the base to the airstrip. It was designed to reduce spills. Internal documents from McMurdo record that in September it split. 1,100 gallons of oil spilt onto the ice. The scientists who come to study the pristine continent are leaving their mark. The road runs past the memorial to Scott and his comrades high on Observation Hill. Beyond is a continent still virtually pristine, almost untouched by humanity. Below, at the foot of Observation Hill, the first town of the continent, McMurdo Base, or as a politician once called it, the slum of Antarctica. Built by the Navy, McMurdo is home to 1,300 people in the summer. It's controlled by civilians, the government's National Science Foundation, which runs the US Antarctic Research Program. So shocked was Congress by revelations of pollution at McMurdo that they allocated $30 million over 5 years to clean it up. $8 million are being spent this year alone. On this evidence, there's a long way to go. The McMurdo dump. Thousands of tons of rubbish are tipped in a landfill. The Antarctic Treaty advises against incineration because of the pollution, yet the rubbish here is burnt every month. They send some rubbish back to a tip at Port Hueneme, California, but regulations imposed by the Environmental Protection Agency are tightening. It's getting more difficult, say officials, to dump rubbish there, especially batteries and contaminated drums. Skewers feed on rubbish dumped in the cause of science. In these barrels are thousands of tons of unidentified toxic waste. Oil, antifreeze, paint, chemicals from laboratories, all put here before controls were tightened. The Science Foundation say it's costing hundreds of thousands of dollars to identify the contents. Officials confirmed that these boxes do contain asbestos. They asked us not to film inside the compound because they said it was dangerous. Yet we saw people working here without protection from the fibres. This was the first McMurdo dump. Scientists found it contained waste food from the station galley and old Navy honey buckets, which held human excrement. Sewage is still pumped virtually untreated into the bay, though they do have a new plant to macerate or mash up human waste. The Antarctic Treaty recommends that stations with more than 30 people should treat their sewage before piping it into the sea. But then the Antarctic Treaty also says nations should take all reasonable steps to reduce pollution of Antarctic waters. The bay itself, Scott's old winter quarters bay, has been found to be one of the most polluted small harbours in the world. Levels of hydrocarbons from fuel leaks are 5 times higher than those in the Forth Estuary in Scotland. Beneath the ice, scientists have found cadmium, mercury, lead, copper, zinc, and silver. Official records show that until 6 years ago, refuse was left on the ice to sink or float away. Only months ago, according to internal documents, a bulldozer fell into a crevasse in the sea ice. Officials decided to leave it where it was. A team from Moss Landing Laboratory in California has been called in to gauge the extent of the pollution. On the seabed, they found tractors, storage sheds, pipelines, hoses, tires, and 55-gallon drums.
Inside the bay, it looks like the backs of harbors in Europe and the backs of harbors in our worst harbors in the United States, except it's very small. We don't have harbors that small that are that bad. It's all our big harbors. Small harbors along our coast, for example, are much cleaner than this little small harbor. And it drops off exponentially. You can swim out of it. It just tremendous amounts of junk drops into the clean Antarctic environment. So if you tried to dig that up, you may drift a lot of junk, particularly contaminated, hydrocarbon-contaminated sediments, out away from the station where a lot of people are doing research, and it's a very neat bottom. So our recommendations have been, geez, leave it alone, don't touch it. But I think it'll be decades before the sediment gets to the point where the hydrocarbons are degraded so that you get a good natural fauna back into it.
Across the bay from McMurdo at Marble Point, Oliver and his divers are examining the sea bed around an iceberg. The berg scours the bottom as it drifts out to sea. They'll compare the damage here with that caused by human activities at Winter Quarters Bay.
Turn that click a few times, will you? You know, it's on that one of those automatic Yaki things. This is a natural disturbance that's just tremendous in its scale and its disruption. The area that it disturbs and the degree to which it rips things up, it completely defaunates, rips away the entire animal communities. Just that berg alone is almost as big as what Winter Quarters Bay looks like.
But even Marble Point is not beyond the reach of McMurdo. While Oliver and his team are diving through the ice, the US icebreaker Polar Sea is piping oil across the ice to refuel a Navy depot on shore. The pipe has broken and fuel has gushed out.
That drum! No. You want them over there, okay.
Sailors are labouring with shovels and absorbent paper to clean up what they can. They won't say how many gallons have been spilt, but later an officer from the ship told us they had no hope of returning the bay to its pristine state. In their terms, it's a minor accident, but it will leave one more small smudge on Antarctica. At the other end of the pipeline, the US Navy's helicopter refueling depot. In contrast to the efforts being made on the ice, spills here appear to attract little attention. It's the responsibility of Eric Chang, the National Science Foundation's senior official at McMurdo. The Foundation has called in scientists from the government's Argonne laboratory to recommend ways of cleaning up the operation.
The operations here at McMurdo have a 35-year history to them, and much of that history occurred before the advent of environmental laws and regulations, before there was a real public consciousness about the environment, before people really felt that what they dispose of could come back to haunt them.
To an outsider, a simple answer would, on the surface, seem to be just shovel everything up, put it in a boat, take it back to Port Wainimi, take it to the Navy's depot, dump it.
Well, I think that runs into some of the problems. The other part of the studies that Argonne is looking at, what are the laws of the countries that govern the import of this material? We, in a sense, are very liable for the things that we send off the ice. We have to know what it is that is leaving the Antarctic so that it can be properly disposed of when it hits the States.
Even though this is American waste from an American base in Antarctica, American laws prevent its return until it's clearly identified.
Well, the analysis we've done to date, the single 55-gallon drum can run anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000, depending on what the mix of the material is. Typically it's petroleum products or glycol or some mix of that. But it's going to be a very expensive process, several $100,000 that in the budget for analysis of these drums just this year alone.
Cleaning up waste from all the bases will be high on the agenda when the Antarctic Treaty Nations meet 3 weeks from now to hammer out rules to cut pollution.